Greetings, fellow keepers of forgotten lore. I am the archivist, and tonight we descend into the archives to retrieve a story that is not merely cold, but frozen in time. It's a story about a perfect summer afternoon, about the laughter of children echoing through ancient trees, and about a silence that fell so suddenly, so completely, that it has yet to be broken. This is not just a case of missing persons. It is a story about a void, a fivefold emptiness carved into the heart of a community, a wound that refuses to heal. Because in the Whispering Pines National Forest, some things once lost are never meant to be found. The summer of 1985 in rural Oregon was a postcard. It was a season of sun-bleached denim, of cassette tapes warping on car dashboards, of the sweet, sticky scent of blackberries hanging heavy in the air. For the Miller and Peterson families, it was the zenith of that idyllic dream. They lived on the same quiet, tree-lined street in a town so small it felt more like a shared backyard. Their children were inseparable, a chaotic, joyful pack that moved as one organism. There were the Millers, 12-year-old Jacob, the reluctant but fiercely protective leader, 10-year-old Sarah with a book always in her hand and a mind full of fantasy, and 6-year-old Emily, the cherubic youngest, who was never, ever seen without her one-eyed threadbare teddy bear, Barnaby. And then there were the Petersons, 11-year-old Mark, Jacob's best friend and a boy with an engine for a heart, always running, always climbing, and his 9-year-old sister, Jessica, a quiet observer with eyes that seemed to see more than most. 5 children, a constellation of bright, burgeoning lives. That August weekend, they embarked on their annual camping trip, a tradition held as sacred as any holiday. The destination was Whispering Pines, a name that promised gentle breezes and secrets shared between leaves. The forest itself was a colossal living thing, a cathedral of Douglas firs and ancient cedars whose canopy was so dense it dappled the forest floor in a perpetual twilight, even at high noon. The air was thick with the smell of pine needles and damp earth, a scent so clean and primal it felt like inhaling the very essence of the wild. Birdsong was the constant soundtrack, punctuated by the scolding chatter of squirrels and the drowsy hum of insects. It was a place that felt safe, a world away from the dangers of cities and strangers. It felt like a sanctuary. They arrived on Saturday morning, the station wagon groaning under the weight of coolers and camping gear. The parents, David and Carol Miller, and Tom and Helen Peterson, worked with practiced ease, unfurling tents and setting up the camp stove. The children exploded from the car, their pent-up energy released into the vastness of the woods. They helped gather kindling, their small hands piling twigs with an earnestness that made their parents smile. By lunchtime, the campsite was a perfect picture of domestic bliss transplanted into the wilderness. Sandwiches were eaten from a red and white checkered blanket, lemonade was poured from a big thermos, and the conversation was light, easy, and full of plans for the weekend. After lunch, as the sun reached its afternoon peak and the parents settled into canvas chairs with books and lukewarm coffee, the familiar, timeless call went out. A game. The ultimate game for a place like this. Hide and seek. Jacob, being the oldest, was designated the first seeker. The rules were established with the solemn gravity only children can muster. No going past the big mossy boulder to the east, and no crossing the shallow, gurgling creek to the west. The campsite clearing was base, simple, safe. The other 4 scattered. Sarah and Jessica, giggling, darted behind a thick curtain of ferns. Mark, ever the daredevil, shimmied up the low-hanging branches of a sprawling oak. And little Emily, clutching Barnaby the bear, found a perfect hiding spot inside the hollow of a massive fallen log, its bark soft and decaying. Jacob leaned against the rough bark of a pine tree, his eyes squeezed shut. 1, 2, 3. He began to count, his voice clear and strong in the warm air. His parents listened, a soft smile on their faces. It was the sound of a perfect childhood, the sound of everything being exactly as it should be. The forest seemed to hold its breath with him. The birds quieted. The insects paused their humming. 48, 49, 50. Ready or not, here I come. He opened his eyes. The clearing was empty, the sun filtering through the leaves onto the abandoned picnic blanket. A half-eaten apple sat browning next to an open book. A gentle breeze rustled the treetops, making the whole forest seem to exhale. It was peaceful. He grinned, the thrill of the hunt taking over, and plunged into the green shadows. He found Mark first, of course, a flash of a red t-shirt in the oak tree giving him away. Then, after a bit more searching, he found Sarah and Jessica, their suppressed giggles betraying their fern fortress. The three of them raced back to base, their laughter pealing through the trees. Now only Emily was left, the best hider. She was small and quiet and could tuck herself away into the smallest of spaces. Jacob, Mark, and Sarah fanned out, calling her name. "Emily, we give up! Come on out, Em, you win!" Their calls were lighthearted at first, tinged with admiration for her skill. The sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose, and the shadows in the forest grew longer, darker, stretching like grasping fingers across the mossy ground. The air grew cooler. The calls became more frequent, a little less playful. "Emily!" Carol Miller looked up from her book, a slight frown creasing her brow. The game had been going on for a while. "Kids, it's getting late. Dinner's almost ready," she called out, her voice carrying a maternal authority that usually brought them running. But this time, her call was met only with the chirping of crickets beginning their evening chorus. David Miller stood up, stretching. "All right, super hider, time to come in," he bellowed, his voice booming and good-natured. Silence. A knot of unease began to tighten in the adults' stomachs. It was a subtle shift, the kind of primal parental instinct that senses a change in the atmosphere before the mind can process why. The four parents joined the three older children, their search patterns becoming more systematic, their calls taking on a sharp edge of worry. "Emily, this isn't funny anymore." The name echoed and died among the silent, towering trees. They checked the hollow log first. It was empty. They searched behind every bush, every rock formation, their steps growing quicker, their breathing more shallow. The idyllic afternoon was dissolving, melting away into a twilight thick with a nameless dread. The last rays of sunlight vanished from the sky, and the forest transformed. The comforting, familiar shapes of trees became monstrous silhouettes against a bruised purple sky. Every rustle of leaves was a potential threat. Every snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through their veins. The whispering pines no longer whispered. They loomed, silent and menacing. The search grew frantic, chaotic. Flashlight beams cut jagged, desperate paths through the oppressive darkness. The names were a mantra of terror now. Emily. Mark, Sarah. Jacob, Jessica. Because at some point in that frantic hour, a realization of impossible, soul-crushing horror had dawned. It wasn't just Emily who was missing. They all were. The seekers and the hiders, all four of them, had vanished from the face of the earth. The three who had returned to base were gone. The game had swallowed them all. The campsite, once a beacon of warmth and family, now felt alien and cold. The only things left behind on that checkered blanket were the half-eaten remains of a carefree lunch, and sitting propped against the picnic basket as if placed there by an invisible hand, was Barnaby, the one-eyed teddy bear. Its single plastic eye stared blankly into the suffocating darkness, a silent, solitary witness to an unspeakable vanishing. The profound silence of the woods pressed in, a physical weight, a crushing testament to the five voices that were no longer there to break it. The nightmare had begun. The first 24 hours of any missing person case are a frantic, desperate race against a ticking clock. But in the case of the Whispering Pines 5, it was a race against an opponent that was vast, indifferent, and ancient, the forest itself. By dawn the next day, the single sheriff's vehicle had become the command center for one of the largest search and rescue operations in Oregon's history. The forest floor, usually silent and soft, was churned into a mud bath by the boots of 1,000 desperate volunteers, their headlights cutting frantic beams through the ceaseless Oregon rain that had begun to fall just after midnight. State troopers, seasoned trackers, National Guardsmen, and ordinary people, loggers, teachers, shopkeepers, all converged on the campsite, a human tide pushing against an ocean of green. Detective Frank Harding of the state police arrived on the scene and felt the case settle into his bones like a chill. He was a man in his late 40s, with a face carved by years of seeing the worst of humanity. But this was different. The absence of evidence was an entity in itself. The campsite was pristine. The picnic basket was undisturbed, save for the missing sandwiches. There were no signs of a struggle, no discarded clothing, no blood, not a single footprint leading away from the established trails. The search dogs, brought in to catch a scent, were maddeningly perplexed. They'd follow a trail a few dozen yards into the trees, circling the area where the children were last seen playing, and then stop, whining and confused, as if the children had simply been lifted into the air. Harding interviewed the parents over and over, their faces hollowed out by grief and sleeplessness, their voices hoarse from shouting their children's names into the unforgiving woods. Their stories never wavered. It was a normal day. It was a game of hide and seek. There was nothing and no one out of the ordinary. And then there was nothing. Harding felt like he was investigating a ghost story, a crime with no body, no weapon, and no perpetrator. The only tangible piece of evidence was the teddy bear Barnaby. It was sent to the crime lab, where technicians went over every threadbare inch. They found nothing. No foreign fibers. No unfamiliar DNA. Just the lingering traces of a 6-year-old girl's life. Dirt, grass stains, and the faint, heartbreaking scent of bubble gum. Days bled into a week. The organized grid searches yielded nothing. The search area was expanded, mile by painstaking mile, until it encompassed a vast, nearly impenetrable wilderness. Helicopters chopped the air overhead, their thermal cameras scanning for any sign of heat, any small body huddled against the cold. They found deer, bears, and lost hikers, but not the 5 children. The media descended, turning the tragedy into a national spectacle. The faces of Jacob, Sarah, Emily, Mark, and Jessica were on every newspaper, every television screen. Their school photos staring out at a nation, frozen in a moment of innocence that now seemed like a cruel joke. As the official search began to lose steam, theories began to sprout like fungus in the damp forest soil. The most prominent, and the one Harding chased with dogged determination, was the blue van. A handful of witnesses, a family fishing at a lake several miles from the campsite, remembered seeing a battered sky blue van driving on a service road near the park entrance that Saturday afternoon. It was an uncommon sight on a road used mostly by park rangers and loggers. The driver was described vaguely as a man, maybe with a beard, maybe wearing a hat. It was a sliver of a lead, a ghost of a possibility. Roadblocks were set up. A national alert was issued for any van matching the description. Hundreds of tips poured in, each one leading to a dead end. Another frustrated sigh from a weary detective. Another crushing blow to the families clinging to any sliver of hope. The blue van became a phantom, a symbol of the faceless evil that might have snatched the children from their idyllic world. But in the local taverns and diners, another, older story was being whispered. It was a piece of local folklore, a legend the townspeople had grown up with, a tale used to scare children into staying close to home. It was the legend of the white stag of Whispering Pines. The story went that a spectral, glowing white deer roamed the deepest parts of the forest. It was said to be a guardian, but a capricious one. The legend claimed that the stag would sometimes appear to lost children, its ethereal beauty luring them not to safety, but deeper into the woods, deeper into a place from which there was no return. A place between worlds. It was nonsense, of course, a campfire story, but in the absence of answers, in the face of such a complete and total mystery, the line between logic and folklore began to blur. The forest felt different to the searchers now. The rustle of leaves sounded like a whispered invitation. A fleeting glimpse of a deer through the trees would cause hearts to stop. What if, they wondered in their darkest moments, the forest itself was the monster? A year passed. The national media moved on to the next tragedy. The search parties dwindled from thousands to a handful of die-hard volunteers, and then finally to just the 4 parents, who would spend every weekend, every holiday, walking the same trails, calling the same names into the same silent woods. Their hope had curdled into a kind of grim, mechanical ritual. They were no longer searching for 5 living children. They were searching for anything. A shoe, a scrap of cloth, a bone. Something to end the torment of not knowing. The empty bedrooms in their homes were preserved as shrines. Toys left exactly where they were, posters still taped to the walls. Birthdays came and went, marked by unlit candles on store-bought cakes. Detective Harding never let the case go. It became his personal demon, the ghost that haunted his waking hours and his dreams. The files for the Whispering Pines, 5 grew thicker and thicker, filled with dead-end leads, crackpot psychic visions, and false confessions from disturbed individuals. He retired 5 years later, but he took the case with him. He built a small office in his home, and the walls were covered with maps of the forest, timelines and the 5 smiling school photos, their eyes following him, silently asking the same question he asked himself every single day. Where did we go? The years fell away like autumn leaves. 10 years, 15, 20. The world changed. Technology evolved. But the mystery of the Whispering Pines 5 remained locked in 1985, a perfect, impenetrable sphere of a question. The parents grew older, their faces etched with a grief that had become a permanent part of their features. The Petersons divorced, the strain too much to bear. The Millers stayed together, united in their shared, unending vigil. The blue van was never found. The white stag remained a whisper in the dark. The case was colder than the deepest winter snow in the Oregon mountains. It was a local tragedy that had hardened into a myth, a cautionary tale told to a new generation of children. And for 2 long, silent decades, it seemed that was all it would ever be. The forest had taken the children, and the forest, it seemed, was determined to keep its secrets. 25 years is a lifetime. It's long enough for a 6-year-old to become a 31-year-old. It's long enough for hope to die 1,000 deaths, for grief to become a dull, constant ache, and for a cold case to be buried under mountains of new ones. For Frank Harding, it was long enough for his black hair to turn to snow, for his sharp eyes to need reading glasses, and for his once powerful stride to become a slow, careful shuffle. He lived a quiet life of retirement, filled with gardening and grandchildren. But every night, before he went to sleep, he would step into his small home office and look at the 5 faces on the wall: Jacob, Sarah, Emily, Mark, and Jessica. His failures. His ghosts. One crisp October morning in 2010, the mail carrier dropped a small, unassuming package into his mailbox. It was a simple brown cardboard box, about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no return address. His name and address were written on the front in neat, anonymous block letters. He carried it inside, a strange sense of unease prickling the back of his neck. In his line of work, anonymous packages were rarely good news. He sat at his kitchen table and carefully sliced through the tape with a paring knife. Inside, nestled in a bed of crumpled newspaper, was a single object, a Polaroid photograph. His first thought was that it was a prank, a cruel and twisted one. The photo had the distinct, slightly faded look of a classic Polaroid, with its thick white border at the bottom. The chemical smell of the developing agent, faint but unmistakable, clung to it. He picked it up, his hand trembling slightly. The image was dark, taken in what looked like a dimly lit room, but the figures in it were clear enough. There were 5 people, standing shoulder to shoulder against a plain wood-paneled wall. 3 young women and 2 young men. They looked to be in their late 20s or early 30s. They were gaunt, unnervingly thin, their faces pale and emotionless. They stared directly into the camera, but their eyes were vacant, hollowed out, as if they were looking at nothing at all. Harding stared, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, a feeling of the past rushing up to swallow the present. He grabbed a magnifying glass from a drawer, his movements clumsy and urgent. He looked closer at the faces, searching for something, anything, and then he saw it. The young man on the far left had a small crescent-shaped scar just above his right eyebrow, a scar Jacob Miller got when he was 7, falling from a bicycle. The young woman next to him had a distinctive mole just beside her nose, the same mole that was clearly visible in Sarah Miller's 10-year-old school picture. And the youngest woman, the one standing in the center, even with the blank expression, the haunted eyes, the shape of her face, the curve of her smile that wasn't smiling. It was Emily. It was unmistakably Emily. He knew their faces as well as he knew his own. They were all there. Jacob, Sarah, Emily, Mark, and Jessica. They were alive. A wave of nausea and disbelief washed over him. He sank back into his chair, the photograph clutched in his hand. They were alive. Or at least they were alive when this picture was taken. He examined the photo again, his detective's mind kicking back into gear, pushing through the shock. The clothing was simple, almost uniform. Plain gray t-shirts and dark pants. There were no distinguishing marks in the room, just the cheap wood paneling. It was a prison of some kind, a basement, a bunker, a place where the sun never reached. He flipped the photo over. Scrawled on the back in the same block lettering as the package were a series of numbers. At first they looked like a code, but then his eyes focused. It was a date, not a date from the past. It was a date from 2 weeks prior. Someone had taken this photograph just 2 weeks ago. After 25 years of silence, someone had reached out. But this wasn't a rescue. It wasn't a cry for help. It felt like something else. A boast, a taunt, a demonstration of power. But then his gaze was drawn back to the front of the picture, to something in the background he had missed in his initial shock. Tacked to the wood-paneled wall just over Emily's shoulder was another photograph, a picture within a picture. It was a postcard, and the image on the postcard was sharp and clear. A soaring green suspension bridge, its Gothic arches unmistakable against a cloudy sky. Harding felt a jolt, a flash of recognition so powerful it took his breath away. He knew that bridge. Every resident of Oregon knew that bridge. It was the St. John's Bridge in Portland, more than 50 miles from where the children had vanished in the Whispering Pines. The implications crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. They weren't lost in the woods. They weren't taken by the fabled white stag. The blue van wasn't a phantom. It was a cage. They had been taken. They had been held, hidden away in plain sight for a quarter of a century. Someone had raised them in the shadows, watched them grow from children into these hollow-eyed adults. And that someone was still out there. That someone had sent this photograph. The Polaroid was no longer a clue. It was a declaration. It reopened a wound that had never truly healed and poured salt into it. The case of the Whispering Pines 5 was no longer cold. It was burning hot, a raging inferno of terrifying new questions. Who took them? Why were they held for so long? And the most chilling question of all, the one that hung in the air like a death sentence. Why send this photo now? Was it a mistake? A sign that the captor's control was slipping? Or was it something far more sinister? A final, terrible message before the 5 people in the photograph were silenced for good? The photo offered the first glimmer of an answer in 25 years, but it also painted a picture of a horror far deeper and more prolonged than anyone had ever dared to imagine. The children hadn't just vanished into the woods. They had been stolen from the world, and somewhere in a dark, wood-paneled room, their long, silent nightmare was still unfolding. The story of the Whispering Pines 5 is not over. With the arrival of a single photograph, a case that was once a memory has become a frantic present-day hunt. The questions it raises are as dark and tangled as the forest where it all began. Was this a message of hope, or a harbinger of a final, tragic end? What kind of monster steals 5 childhoods and keeps them locked away for decades? The truth, I fear, is still out there, waiting in the shadows, as silent and watchful as a one-eyed teddy bear left alone in the woods. Thank you for joining me in the archives tonight. If the stories of the lost and the forgotten call to you, be sure to return. There are always more files to open. Until next time, stay vigilant.